On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Nate Sullivan. He's a CTO at Academia.edu. We're going to be talking about technology strategy and special projects. I think it's really interesting. Nate actually does a lot of work on special projects, exploring technologies that are a few quarters out. We're going to talk to him about where that alignment sits within the product, the company strategy, what he worries about failing, and how does he identify these special projects to work on, and how do they get folded back into the company? Nate, super excited to have you on. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, of course. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. All right, before we start, tell us what you guys do over there.
Yeah, so Academia is a network for researchers. People use it for a few different reasons, but you can think of it as kind of an academic LinkedIn. People share the research that they're working on. They follow each other, keep up to date with their field. Very
cool. All right. So, you are the CTO there. And you mentioned, obviously, in your role, you operate slightly differently. So let's talk about that. I know a lot of CTOs do different things. Some do focus more on tech. Some are a little bit focused on the business, a lot focused on the business. In your case, you mentioned the strategy and special projects. Maybe start from there and give us some insights in terms of what your day-to-day looks like.
Yeah, so I would say that I focus a lot on sort of both the technology and the product and how those two intersect with each other. And so for my day-to-day, I'll there will probably be, two special projects kind of going on that I'll be in the weeds on, and then possibly also just doing some thinking about like, what are the next things we should be exploring? What should we be starting to work on now or thinking about for next quarter?
I guess that's a good segue, because I think, as you had mentioned, you guys do a lot of work in terms of, at least you do work in terms of what's coming up next and, what to identify. When we're talking about these technologies to explore a quarter or two out, or maybe even longer, how far do you start thinking in terms of, how far out do you start thinking about technologies? You mentioned a quarter or two. Is it further than that?
I'm thinking about mostly technologies that we already have a use case for, but that I think are applicable to multiple products or areas of the business. And that if we were purely prioritizing by like, what's the best way to make progress on this product this quarter, we might not prioritize these like more fundamental technologies. And, for a company of, we have about 50 developers, mostly, full stack web developers. And so when I'm looking a couple quarters out, I'm not like, trying to make fundamental advances in artificial intelligence or something like that. What I'm trying to do is figure out what tools are out there in the industry that we don't have a lot of working experience with, that we don't have a lot of that we wouldn't really know how to put into use for our problems, that we should be. And so, I can talk about some examples if that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. I'd like to know, because I think other people are kind of listening to this, and when they hear about special projects, some people might be thinking about experimental stuff. Some people are, probably thinking about, well, where does this fit in the roadmap? But if it's stuff that's, as you kind of talked about, is building off of what you have, kind of talk to us a little bit about what that would even look like.
Recently it's been largely focused on AI, as you might expect. And, I think the recent advances in AI are like particularly applicable to our business. A lot of what we do is academic papers, people finding papers, reading papers, understanding papers. And so, progress in natural language processing is especially applicable to us. So some of the projects I've been involved with have been building out sort of our first AI-powered product, which is called Academia Answers, which is a product that lets you sort of type any research question in, and it pulls answers from 100 million peer-reviewed research papers, which, kind of starts out as a fairly simple RAG application, and then evolves from there to sort of, make better decisions about when can we pull answers from the abstract, when do we have to pull answers from the full text. And, this quarter, one of the special projects I'm looking at is using LLMs to direct our web scraping. A bunch of information that's relevant to academics is publicly available on the web, but spread across 1,000 different sources, papers, grants, stuff like that. And, I think LLMs have the potential to make scraping of diverse websites much easier. It used to be that you had to kind of hard code to the HTML structure of each different website. And so that's an area where, we have at least one immediate business need. I think it might be applicable to multiple different business areas, papers, grants, etc. And we don't already have enough competence in it that I think we could sort of just do it and just know whether it will work. We need to do some experimenting with it first.
Interesting. I guess, you mentioned a few use cases. As you're kind of looking at the emerging technologies, keeping an eye on the future technologies that are coming up. Obviously, you mentioned AI. How far ahead do you look at technologies? Because I guess in this case, AI has been around. The last 2 years, there's been a lot of attention where everyone's now moving into making sure capabilities are built. How far out do you look for emerging technologies, if you are?
I would not really say that I'm trying to look that far beyond the current frontier. I mean, I think the business as a whole should recognize that how fast AI progress has been and think about what does it mean for the business if AI progress continues at that same pace for multiple years. So I think doing that kind of extrapolation is very important. As far as getting into the weeds of I don't really get into the weeds of okay, I wasn't when we were maybe reaching the limits of pre-training and now we're focused, and now LLMs are focused more on reasoning and post-training. I wasn't really getting into the weeds of trying to predict how AI is going to progress past that kind of first potential plateau, because we weren't really going to be working past that plateau. And so, kind of keeping abreast of what people are excited about, but mostly focused on what is the current frontier in the industry.
Okay. Interesting. And I guess as you're looking at these opportunities, and obviously, you guys have a roadmap, what does your relationship with the product team look like? Because obviously you're working on advancing technical feasibility, technical capabilities. When do you talk to the product team? How early is the product team involved in kind of that relationship?
So I work very closely with the product team. We're talking every day, basically. And I would say that for it's when we're pursuing a special project that's more unlocking a technology for the company, I kind of treat the product team as my customer. And it's the crucial thing is building something that a customer actually wants, which is very hard, as we all know. And it requires really understanding their needs, but also, I know about tools that, our pure product folks don't understand as well. And so I know about solutions to problems that they might not naturally think of. So what does that mean in practice? It means that I, have to really understand what are sort of the core user problems that the product team is trying to solve. And so for us, the biggest user problem we try to solve is helping researchers keep up to date with their fields. And then I look out at what are some technologies that might help with that area. And so, a couple of years ago, this meant getting into vectorizing all the papers on our site. Nowadays, it's, other NLP stuff. And then I work with product folks to try to figure out what would some actual applications of this technology to this product area be. And then I think the tricky part is really assessing how promising the technology is for that area. Because I think, if we haven't really worked with the technology before, we aren't really going to know how powerful it is for achieving the goal. And we might be wrong about our first application of it. Like, when we decided to vectorize our corpus, we had like a first use case in mind, but actually that is sort of a general purpose resource that we have now that we use for a bunch of different things that we didn't like realize at the outset it was going to be useful for. There's the sort of judgment call I have to make of like, okay, we have one or two ideas about how this is going to drive specific product and business wins, but I have to, use my judgment to decide, should I prioritize it sort of just according to those one or two impacts we know about, or do I think that there's actually a larger thing that we unlock here that's the reason to prioritize this now?
I guess as you're talking about prioritizing and you're working on some of these projects, is there a point in which, if you see the idea or the capabilities not developing, that you go, okay, you know what, we tried this out, time to throw in the towel and go find something else? Is there a duration of time? Is there any type of, metric set up or any type of evaluation done to kind of judge progress and or how things are progressing before a special project might have to be stopped?
So usually when we start on them, there's like a specific time horizon. We kind of don't start it with just like blank check, work on this indefinitely. We're usually like, okay, we think in this quarter we can, in a quarter we can, unlock this technology for the company, or we can build this series of prototypes that helps us much better understand how powerful this technology is for this variety of use cases. And so I would say from the very outset, we're thinking about how can we assess whether this special project is getting us somewhere valuable and what would make us want to, double down on it in the future. And so for a new technology, oftentimes the first place we want to get to is just like a prototype that people in the company can look at. And that's another place where I like loop in the product team is, especially my coworkers who have academic backgrounds. It's really useful for them to look at, here's the kind of results that this technology is producing. Maybe I'm swapping out a component of the recommendation algorithm that we use to recommend papers to people. And so we build a prototype like, okay, if we power recommendations based on this, how do those look for you specifically? So prototypes are often sort of the first checkpoint where we can get an idea of like, is this something valuable? We might get to the point of an A/B test. If we were changing our recommendation algorithm, that's definitely an example where we would be running an A/B test. And, we, at the beginning of the quarter, we have some rough idea of how we'll make a decision about whether to continue funding it the next quarter. But when we get to the end, I think also, I just reflect on what we've learned and, chat with some of the engineers on the team and get a sense of like, okay, did we give this technology a fair shake this quarter? Or did we kind of make some rookie mistakes, kind of get the wrong end of the stick somehow? And actually, if we were starting over, we'd approach it this totally different way. And should we consider doing that now? Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's like, well, we got bad results, but I think we did it the wrong way.
I guess to extend that, because I think you mentioned, we talked about, what do you have to see not to advance it? And obviously, and you mentioned running A/B tests, and as you're kind of progressing and getting to that point, some projects do. How, I guess, when you're looking and evaluating those A/B tests, and you mentioned, swapping out a recommendation engine, I mean, those are some big critical components to shift. Of these special projects that go into production, what's that process look like, and what is it that you're hoping to see? Obviously, you want improvement, I'm sure, on things, but what do you have to see from a more, maybe a more metrics basis, or how you evaluate things to know, okay, I think this is something that users will benefit from?
I'd say some technologies are like quite immediately applicable to products and some aren't. The ones that are immediately applicable are the ones that like might get an A/B test early on in the exploration. And, it is a big deal to change our recommendation algorithm. It's, one of the core features of the site. And so for that in particular, we'll do a limited rollout at first. We probably won't do a 50-50 test across the whole population if we're unsure about this new algorithm. We might do it limited or just limited in time as well. We'll often also limit it just because, when we implemented this new algorithm in like a prototype way, it doesn't scale that well out of the box. That's a separate piece of work that we're only going to do if the A/B test wins. So the A/B test kind of tells us, definitely helps guide how much we're going to prioritize it in the future. And I think, again, it comes back to that judgment question of how far do I see this technology improving other features on the site, helping solve other business problems. When we first vectorized our corpus, one of the first applications was, when you're reading a paper on the site, we show you related papers on the side that you might want to check out in a sidebar. And we replaced our old related papers algorithm, which used TF-IDF, another NLP technique. This new one used vector similarity, and we saw a click-through rate win on that sidebar. And that sidebar isn't like that important for the business. It doesn't drive that many clicks, looking at the business as a whole. But it was like a great test bed for like how big an improvement is this technology, vector similarity, against the old technology that we were using, which is TF-IDF. So that was a case where we chose an A/B test that let us get sort of a clean read on how big user-facing improvement the new technology was, that sort of anticipated future business problems we could apply it to, that were future bigger business problems.
I mean, that's actually really, I think, great answer, because I think you gave us a lot of depth and understanding of that process. I guess when you're working with your engineering team and you're obviously looking at these technologies, is it just you? Do you have a couple of engineers? Because I guess if somebody's listening to this going, well, I certainly would like to, as a CTO, be a little bit more involved in special projects. What does your team look like that kind of works on these things?
So I work very closely with a staff engineer who is sort of an AI leader in the company. And then I also just try to get thoughts from engineers who I think have like very good judgment from around the company. Hear like what emerging technologies they think are interesting that we should explore. Hear what kind of problems they're facing on their teams that they think some new technology might be able to solve. And so I go pretty wide for like ideas about technologies that might be worth exploring. And then I think the person who's in the weeds the most is this staff engineer.
I guess when you're going through this process and you're working with the business, you're providing updates. I guess the one thing that could be of interest for people listening is, what do you report on progress? Because obviously these are projects that maybe do get reported on, maybe they get thrown away. I mean, obviously people want to understand, where budget's going. People understand progress. Like, what gets communicated from this to your leadership and your, peers at your level?
I think that communicating out is very important, because I do think like a major risk for technology exploration projects is that they're like kind of in the lab, but somehow lose sync with what we're really trying to accomplish, and kind of become like just pure lab experiments. And for me, staying in sync with the rest of the exec team is like a huge way that I try to keep these special projects pointed towards a problem that is going to be important for the business. And so, a decent amount of that is just like informal conversations about what's going on the team, what the other execs are thinking about, what, progress I'm seeing that I'm excited about, that like I want to start getting like other execs familiar with so they can start thinking about where to use this functionality in products. And so some of it is informal conversations. Some of it is, I mentioned those like internal prototypes. I definitely try to like get other execs' eyes on those internal prototypes to just try them out. And I'd say another portion of those informal conversations is just staying in sync on like what their needs are, what needs they're seeing in the business, and like me trying to keep track of like, okay, are we still tackling a problem that's like really important to the business, or has somehow the business shifted and we should be thinking about something else?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think when we first talked about the topic, I think there was a lot of, in terms of how the process works and kind of how your involvement looks, all these different questions. Because I don't think every CTO gets a chance, and I think you're chief technology officer. You've got to set the tone sometimes, and I think this kind of gives you that visibility. If somebody does end up having a question and they want to set up more special projects and kind of go through what you've been discussing, is there a good way of touching base with you to learn a little bit more about the details?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is the best way to reach me.
I will definitely get that in the show notes. And Nate, thanks again for joining. Thanks again for being on the show, and fantastic insights into the process.
Great. Thanks, Mia. This was fun.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think when Nate and I first spoke about the topic, I was very interested because I don't always hear a CTO working on these types of special projects. And Nate kind of dove in and gave us insights in terms of where he's looking for things, how he's looking for things, the success or failure, talking to his leadership about progress. I think he shared a lot, which I'm super stoked about. So please share this with somebody else who might enjoy hearing more. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.